Welcome back to Bodhi Tree Buddhism for class number 27 in our long series reading the modern classic, The Way to Buddhahood by Venerable Master In Shun. Now, last session, we finished up just above here looking at the analysis of karma, and that relates to the second of the Four Noble Truths, which is the cause or the origins of dissatisfaction, dukkha. So last week we had looked at some of the ways, some of the models through which karma can be analyzed, talking about the process itself, talking about the three modes, body, speech, and mind, also wholesome, unwholesome, etc., and looking at this metaphor and or analogy of the process of karmic actions leading to the results as being like a seed. Now that brings us up to our content for today, for class number 27, which is looking at the three unwholesome roots. So this is getting right down to the sort of core elements of the content of the second noble truths. So let's read the Chinese and the English first, and then we can talk about the content itself. 烦恼贪嗔痴不善之根本，痴如醉如迷。 Actually, I think we already had a look at this part last week. So we were talking about the three roots of the afflictions, which are desire, aversion, and ignorance. And I made a note that these work at a very subtle level. It's not what we normally talk about like greed or hatred, but even on a very subtle level, that movement towards, movement away, and ignorance, desire, aversion, and ignorance are our three basic roots, and some of the problems with each. And actually, this week, we're up to the second line here. The second verse in this series, verse number 74. 我摄诸烦恼，见爱慢无明，我所摄故，十生永相续. The Buddha subsumed all mental afflictions with views, craving, conceit, and ignorance, due to being included within me and mine, death and rebirth continue forever. Okay, so the first line is just sort of saying, when we use this term subsume, it's got a bit of a technical origin, but it comes from this idea that if we're going to break it down and we can talk about, like a category of things, what's the overarching category? What's the common feature that they all have that we can sort of subsume them under? And so while sometimes when we use an analysis of karma and thus the mental afflictions, and also just as basically a synonym for the second noble truth, we use the three we just talked about before, so desire, aversion, and ignorance. But another one is to look at them in terms of views, craving, conceit, and ignorance as well. So it's a slightly different model here. Views. Now, within these, I mean, there are obviously different words in English. One thing that might catch people is views and ignorance. So I think we mentioned it briefly last week. It's worth talking about again. When we talk about views, which at other times can be a subcategory of ignorance, but specifically views are what we might call like intellectually formed ignorance. So it's like a misunderstanding because of our very conceptual model and our very ways of understanding things. So from a Buddhist point of view, to say if somebody has this idea that like, there's no such thing as causality, things are random. And they might come to that conclusion through, all sorts of reasons. Modern people just because somebody told them on the internet, but, they might say like, oh, well, I tried to do the same thing 3 or 4 different times, but every time it came to a different result. Therefore, there's no connection between causes and effects. So this might be like a really simple example of why people come to this conclusion, this view that things are random, like the relationship between cause and effect. Now, of course, there's many other views, different views that are important. One of the big ones, for example, is the idea that wholesome actions don't lead to happiness. You might say, well, you do wholesome action. If you treat people well or you treat people badly, it doesn't matter. Makes no difference in the end. That would be an intellectually formed view, right? And there's a zillion and one reasons why people come to that conclusion. Whereas ignorance, on the other hand, isn't like a view. It's not something that one can like intellectually sort of articulate at all, but it's just a basic fact of not knowing. So in that way, it's also quite a bit more subtle. And when we look at the Buddhist descriptions of liberation, so at the moment, this part of the text, we're looking at the teachings common to the three vehicles, so it applies to all the forms of liberation. We talk about the 4 stages of sanctity until one attains arahantship, or basically self-liberation from samsara. In the first phase, the first of those 4 stages is basically when one gets rid of the view of a self, and that's intellectually formed view of a self. But it's not until right near the end, until one attains arahantship itself, that they get rid of basic fundamental ignorance. Now, craving and conceit are kind of different things. Craving, as we've talked about, is more of an emotional thing. So that's just basically comes from when we have our senses have this sort of interaction with sense objects. And in addition to being conscious of them, we also have some kind of sensation. It might be, oh, it's a pleasant sensation. I look at this flower and it's pleasant. And then, now the pleasant feeling isn't the problem, but then we might have this tendency towards desiring and wanting to possess that object or something like that. Now, that then is a purely emotional response. However, just to note here, when we're talking about craving, it also actually includes aversion as well. You might think, aren't craving and aversion like totally the opposites? In a way, yes, one's movement towards pleasant experience, one's movement away from unpleasant experience, but they're both the same in that they are actions or movements with respect to sensation, which views and ignorance are not. Conceit is also a very subtle form, and it's also one of the forms that's one of the last to be eradicated on the path. And I often translate this as self-conceit because it's slightly subtly different from what we normally can think of as conceit. So usually in English, when we talk about conceit, we put it up there with, say, arrogance, for example, or pride. And conceit is usually in English, right? Just the English word, not the technical Buddhist sense here, is the sense of being better than someone. But actually, the problem here isn't necessarily wanting to be better than someone. It's just the comparison to others in general. So you might think, well, if pride is a sin, well, what about being humble? Well, if you want to be really strict about it in a Buddhist sense, humbleness can also be an affliction because it grasps a view of self. So if you say, I'm better than you, or I'm better than other people, well, obviously that's a big bit of ego. That's a problem. But if you say, oh, not so much humbleness, maybe not the right word, but if you say something like, oh, oh, I'm not worthy, oh, you're all so much better than me, I'm just terrible, I'm useless, there's still a sense of a self. And so what we mean here by conceit, the term, if you look at the term here in Chinese, man, this character here, in Sanskrit, it's mana, and it comes from a similar verbal root to weigh and compare. So basically, any time that we're assessing ourselves and comparing ourselves to others, whether it's thinking one is better than others or worse than others, or even equal to others, because it has the same basic idea of a self-identity, it's also a problem, also an affliction. So these 4 categories: intellectually formed views, craving and aversion as emotional responses toward and away from sensations, present and unpleasant sensations, conceit, which is this self, identity-based comparison with others in any form, and ignorance is very fundamental, not knowing, not understanding, are another model, sort of a 4-fold model, a way of classifying all other mental afflictions. They can all be put into these somewhere. Okay, let's look at the last 2 lines, which is kind of, well, the third one's really quite critical as well, due to being included within me and mine. Now, I've put the me and the mind here in little like quote marks, again, indicating that these are concepts that we have. These are ideas, perceptions. And so, we've already talked about conceit, and it's having the sense of me or mine or self, but the others also function in the same basic way as well. Last class, we talked about, there's all these various ways of classifying affliction. Sometimes it's like the 3 the three unwholesome roots. Sometimes here's this fourfold system. We also talked last week about another one, which is basically considered views and craving. But often, if you want to give the short answer, most Buddhist traditions say the root affliction is ignorance. And what's the root form of ignorance? It is this belief or this clinging to a self. Now, sometimes we'll see just belief in a self, like one thing. Sometimes we'll see two here, like me and mine. Sometimes we'll also see three, like me, mine, and belief in a self. So there are some, again, there's some slightly different ways of describing this, but the core thing is still the same. It's still having at heart the sense of a self, some kind of enduring me, some kind of enduring entity, and various qualities are usually attributed to it. So one is, kind of endurance, which means like permanence, like the me from today and the me from yesterday and the me that will be tomorrow is still the same me. Same me as last year, same me as, you get the idea, right? Back, when I was born, we still say my birthday. Born little baby, and that was still me, and this is still me now. It's the same me. So we have the sense of enduring permanence about that. Various other qualities attributed to that as well. That's one basic form. And again, another most common form or another common idea associated with it is the idea of some kind of like autonomy. So there's this distinct me. It has, it's distinct from conditions around me. So there's all these other external phenomena. They can influence me, but they don't, I interact with them maybe, but the me itself still stays the same, right? So this is when we get closer to the idea that is often seen in some of the other religious traditions around the time of the Buddha, sense of an Atman, the sense of a Jiva, Pudgala, a Purusha, many different terms, but basically having a similar idea of this eternal, unchanging, autonomous entity. You can call it what you will. So the views, craving, conceit, and ignorance also can be boiled down to this idea as well. So let you give one example. I mean, we've already talked about how views, for example, can be related to me and mine. Conceit also, and ignorance, this fundamental ignorance of thinking that there is like a self. How about craving though? That's often a trickier one. And often because we have these two categories of sort of like intellectual views and emotional cravings or aversions, they kind of get put as though they're separate, but they can still work together as well. Because let's say, for example, when one forms an idea of self or idea of who one is, so you might think, oh, I'm a hip, cool person. I'm very popular. I've got a great fashion sense. Okay, so let's say you build up your view of me and mine and I around this idea. That will affect the things that you are emotionally attracted to and repulsed by as well. So you think like, I'm a great fashionista. Oh, there's no way I'd be caught dead wearing those clothes, right? So you look at this clothing, you're seeing it, and because of your view, that view is actually then helping to generate this unpleasant like sensation with respect to those things, and of course a rejection of them, or something else. Or there might be some, the reverse, whereby because you portray yourself in a certain way, your tastes, for example, then there are certain forms of clothing that you do like, right? You have craving towards. And it's not just clothing, of course. I mean, we do this all the time. We do it with things like music, for example. I'm someone who likes classical music, and therefore classical music I'm attracted towards, I have craving towards, and other forms of, I don't know, punk rock and roll or something, I don't, because that's not who I am. So there's still this really powerful and very fascinating interaction between the intellectually formed views and intellectually formed sense of self and I, and also the emotional side. And they will kind of go back and forth against each other. Now, I've just given examples of how the view of self can influence craving, but it can also be the other way around as well. I mean, why do we build up various forms of self? Often it's because of a form of craving. Something that feels pleasant to us, we will intellectually try to justify it, why it's good. Things that are unpleasant to us, we will intellectually try to justify why it's a bad thing. All right. So what we think of as good and bad is an intellectually formed view. And often that in turn is based upon various sensations and experiences, cravings and aversions that we have towards those objects. Now, a lot of those, of course, can be formed at a very early age, can be imputed on us from society, and even the relationships between the intellectual understanding of things and the emotional side of things can also be passed down within societies and cultures, within families, for example. Bottom line, when we have these, death and rebirth continue forever. It's pretty powerful stuff. Once those views are in place, sense of self is in place, various emotional afflictions with respect to those, that cycle of rebirth just continues. Now, this brings us up to a very important topic here, dependent origination. So let's have a look. We've got a couple of verses here for this very important topic. Let's see if we can briefly just talk about verse number 75, and maybe in our next class we can get into the details. So verse 75, 苦集想构禅，慈伤从缘起，佛说是而知，汝常如果树。Dissatisfaction and accumulation mutually enwrap one another. Death and rebirth from dependent origination was taught by the Buddha in 12 limbs, which are like a city or like a fruit tree. So the first line there, dissatisfaction, accumulation, mutually enwrap one another. So now we've already talked earlier, and we just talked about the Four Noble Truths as the classic example in Buddhism about dependent origination, right? So we've got dissatisfaction, cause, cessation, and the path. For now, let's talk about the first two. So dissatisfaction, dukkha, suffering, whatever term you want to use, is the result, and accumulation or origin or source, is the second truth, is the cause, basic cause and effect relationship. But they also mutually enwrap one another. It's not, you might think, well, this causes this, end of story, but it's not. Think about it for a moment. And think about it in terms of what we've been talking about in this mental process, right? So we have afflictions. When we encounter objects, we look at something, we smell something, taste something, whatever. You're walking down the street, you see a person that looks very pleasant to you. You see that person, and due to seed potentials that you have in your own mind, as a result, you also get this pleasant sensation. Of course, we already have the ignorance by thinking that the pleasant sensation belongs to the person that we see. It does not. People, no objects are inherently pleasant or unpleasant. However, we have potentials and tendencies towards generating sensations of pleasant and unpleasant with respect to objects. So let's say you see that, the person looks pleasant to you, which really means that cognition of that person is a cause for generating pleasant sensations from within yourself. Okay, so what's the response? The usual response to pleasant sensation and this ignorance, because we think it belongs to the person, is craving, desire. And so what happens here, so that craving, and then whatever you think of this person, so think of like process of attraction or whatever between people. And then if you can't see that person, or you want to see that person, but you're, unable to do so, or they don't want to see you, we have this unpleasant suffering, right? So the suffering of not getting what you want, for example, or being separated from pleasant things, right? We've already talked about this within the 8 forms of dissatisfaction. Okay, so then what happens? What happens when this happens? So we've already talked about like from the afflictions to dissatisfaction. So what happens when you can't get that? And so you just need to look in the news, the daily news, to see what people do when they want to get something, obtain something. And it also applies to people, the horrible things that people do supposedly out of attraction to other people. Now we don't need to go into all the details, but then that suffering itself causes more afflictions, because what happens when we suffer? Painful experience. How do we usually respond? We normally respond with aversion. And actions driven by aversion, more unwholesome karma. And what's the result of those? More painful experience. Right? So the afflictions leading to suffering, when suffering comes, it then becomes one of the stimuli for further actions based on afflictions. This is what's meant by dissatisfaction and accumulation mutually enwrap one another. They bring about each other, and boom, next thing we know, boom, we're in this nasty spiral going on. Death and rebirth from dependent origination was taught by the Buddha in 12 limbs. Now, we're going to talk about those in detail. Often, I know for a lot of people learning about Buddhism, we get told dependent origination, 12 limbs of dependent origination, or 12 links. Usually in English, we use this term like a chain and the links of a chain. Technically, it's a limb, link, doesn't make much difference. But that's just one classic example of the explanation of dependent origination through this process of birth and death, through whole lifetimes. Okay, it's not the only case though. You can talk about dependent origination as we have been with the Four Noble Truths. That works perfectly well. And there's other formulas which don't give 12, they give 7, they give 15, they give 20. So don't get too hung up on the 12 limb or the 12 link model. Okay, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit later, but just for now, let's just have this idea in mind that this whole process between dissatisfaction and accumulation is this whole cycle. That samsara, just rolling over. And we're going to break that down into more detail and look at it here in the classic 12 link system. And there's a couple of metaphors for that. It's like a city or like a fruit tree. A city, the idea being that living beings are kind of like trapped within the city. And even with the gates of the city, they're sort of guarded. You can't get out. So you're just like entrapped inside, going round and round in circles. And another metaphor like a fruit tree, which is a metaphor we've already used before, right? So if you think about like the life of some fruit tree, let's say an apple tree, is one lifetime. So before that apple tree grew, it came from the seed of a past lifetime. It's parental tree. So that parental tree had fruit, which had seeds. The seeds drop. They form a new tree, which grows and flowers and fruits. And then those fruit in turn drop, and the seeds in the fruit cause another one. Now, this is a metaphor, okay? We're not saying that, dependent origination is exactly like this, because you could say, well, then dependent origination is simply from my parents to me and me to my children, etc. That's not Buddhist dependent origination, and that's not Buddhist cyclic existence either. I know this idea is actually, I've seen it as slightly popular within Western interpretations of Buddhism, and it's wrong. It's just it's incorrect. But it's a useful metaphor, the metaphor of continuance. Of course, one of the big differences is simply it's possible that you can grow an apple tree and it will not seed and grow any new apple trees. Does that mean the end of samsara for the apple tree? No, it just means that the metaphor isn't a perfect metaphor, right? Likewise, if we say, oh, is samsaric existence just simply from one generation, from parent to child, and in turn, well, then if somebody dies before having children or chooses not to have children, does that mean they've escaped samsara? No, it doesn't. It just means the metaphor doesn't match up perfectly, okay? So just keep that in mind. But the idea is, it's this process, and it goes through round after round after round, continues on without end. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Metaphors have the elements. Okay, now we could continue. Let's just do a really quick little look at what comes next, even though we're not going to cover it all in detail. Next, we're going to be talking then about all the links of dependent origination, right? So we've got ignorance, we've got craving, cognition. We then go on from there. We have the name and form, the body and mind, the sense organs, which have contact with sensory objects. We get sensations, and from sensations, we have craving and then grasping. And with grasping, there's future existence, right? So we die still having grasping deep within our minds, and then that brings about the future existence, the next lifespan, which in turn has further birth, old age, disease, and death, etc. ad nauseum. Okay, so next class, tune in, and we're going to be going through the 12 links of dependent origination one by one and talking about all of those then. So thanks for tuning in again. I hope to see you again in the next session. Take care.